Hello humans, and welcome back to another edition of the Retro Rumble, your one-stop shop for wrestling retrospectives. My name is Blake Spivey, and oh boy do we have a good one for all of you today. No match or pay-per-view review on this episode, folks. We're going to spend today doing a retrospective, a deep dive into wrestling history. Today, it's all about the black and gold, NXT. Now, before we get to where NXT is today, we've got to go back to the birth of its concept.
Ready, set, go! So Young gets another opportunity, but Sheffield should be fired up here.
No. A little bit farther back than that.
No, not Tommy, no! Oh my God!
When Extreme Championship Wrestling closed its doors in 2001, a void was left for hard-hitting and serious action as an alternative to WWE. In 2004, WWE released The Rise and Fall of ECW, a post-mortem documentary DVD that was incredibly successful. Seeing that the ECW fan base was alive and well, Rob Van Dam went to Vince McMahon and pitched the idea for an ECW reunion show. Thus, One Night Stand was born. Tons of ECW stars, phenomenal matches, and an overarching narrative of WWE invaders led to One Night Stand pay-per-view buys breaking WWE's website. It was such a breath of fresh air for fans who had grown tired of the WWE product at the time. The event was so successful that WWE issued a second One Night Stand event in 2006, which was just as good in its own way, and it also featured Rob Van Dam beating John Cena on ECW territory to win the WWE Championship. Off the success of these events, WWE decided it was time to revive ECW as its own brand with its own roster, separate from Raw and SmackDown. On June 13th, 2006, a year and a day after the first One Night Stand event, ECW was back on television. Alright, sweet! Now how are we going to kick off this new era of Extreme? So, ECW is introduced to the new fan base via a guy dressed as a zombie. Sure, Sandman comes and beats him up later, but that's not what the original ECW was about, and it's certainly not what new fans are going to latch on to. As time progressed, ECW featured legends like the Sandman, Tommy Dreamer, and Sabu, but a lot of time was spent highlighting the next generation of Extreme talent, such as Elijah Burke, Kevin Thorne, and especially this guy.
What does everybody want?
No, I meant this guy. CM Punk was the start of a new era of WWE, and he was exclusive to ECW. You add that to the proven entities like Kurt Angle and Rob Van Dam, and you've got the potential for a phenomenal weekly wrestling show. And by the time I have finished this sentence, WWE dropped the ball with the ECW relaunch. Critical points like moving CM Punk to Raw, RVD getting arrested for marijuana possession, and Kurt Angle getting his release from the company, ECW started to feel like just another hour of content WWE was having to put out every week. It highlighted some stars over the years, but the problem was none of them were homegrown stars. A major selling point of the original ECW was that there were so many fresh faces and homegrown talent that the local fan base immediately could latch onto and care about. And the ECW rebrand just didn't do that. So, mercifully, in early 2010, Vince McMahon killed ECW for the second time. Now that ECW was dead, something needed to replace its time slot on Sci-Fi, so they introduced a program called NXT. Nope, we're still not there yet. This version of NXT was a game show for all intents and purposes, from points based on wins and losses to actual in-ring trivia contests and obstacle courses. Independent talent dubbed rookies were almost written to be like jokes, which kind of ticked off the fan base a little bit, especially with Daniel Bryan, who was an independent wrestling darling. What ticked fans off the most was that Daniel Bryan was the first one eliminated from the competition, even if he had the best wrestling quality by a country mile. The contest kept going until Wade Barrett won the thing and earned a WWE contract. Barrett began his main roster run by doing the unthinkable. He brought the other NXT rookies with him to Raw, and they decimated everything. Daniel Bryan would even be fired for choking the announcer with his tie, which is something that was deemed too violent for a PG show by sponsors. They beat up everyone, from referees to announcers to John Cena to CM Punk. They tore up the ring apron. It truly was a sight to behold. Dubbing themselves the Nexus, Barrett and Co. decided to run rampant on WWE programming, ambushing and attacking anyone that got in their way. Their slogan was, "You're either Nexus or you're against us." This all led to a 7-on-7 elimination tag team match, pitting the Nexus against John Cena and 6 of WWE's best and brightest, including Hall of Famer Bret Hart, who was way past his prime. In one of the most backwards, boneheaded booking decisions I've ever seen, John Cena wins? All that hype, all that build-up, and the Nexus lose their first match as a team. Whatever, I'm getting off topic. That's a story for another time. Game show NXT lasted for a few more seasons, but was eventually canned. What a long road to get to where we are, but finally, we were at a point where the rose began to bloom. The first episode of the new NXT aired on June 20th, 2012, emanating from Full Sail University, and from here, we begin the quest to crown the first ever NXT champion. We get an 8-man tournament with the finals taking place on August 29th between Seth Rollins and Jinder Mahal. After a great match, Seth Rollins is the first man to win the NXT championship, and we officially enter the era of NXT we all know and love. Sort of. You see, while NXT was mimicking the ECW of old, in a small arena being cheered by a tight-knit group of fans, NXT was still a web-exclusive show, not being seen by a mass audience. That would all change in February 2014, however, with the advent of the WWE Network, WWE's new streaming service that featured the entire WWE content library and then some, new programming specifically curated for the platform, and all live pay-per-view events. You'd think something like this would call for WrestleMania to be the first event live streamed on the network. But no, that honor went to the increasingly popular NXT. NXT Arrival was the first ever event broadcasted live from the WWE Network, and it showcased some of NXT's best and brightest stars, like Sami Zayn, Tyler Breeze, Paige, Emma, and especially the main event ladder match, pitting Adrian Neville against the NXT champion, Bo Dallas. The show was a massive success and spawned the advent of a series of NXT live specials which would soon be dubbed NXT TakeOver. By mid-2015, names like Bo Dallas and Neville had been called up to the main roster, and their spots were filled by Kevin Owens and Finn Balor. Now, these two had an incredible rivalry in NXT in 2015, which was showcased a lot on TV, but notably at Beast in the East. Essentially a live WWE house show televised on the network, which took place in Tokyo, Japan. A major selling point of the show was the appearance of Brock Lesnar, but what stole the show was the NXT Championship match between Kevin Owens and Finn Balor. Balor, who had performed in Japan prior to joining NXT, had his coronation moment in front of his home wrestling crowd, and I'll tell you, 13-year-old Blake watching this show live at 5 o'clock in the morning really enjoyed what he saw. NXT was reliable now. It was almost a guarantee that NXT could provide a top-quality card, which was something that the main roster just couldn't do. So in August of 2015, WWE took the chance on NXT and held a takeover special live from the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, New York during SummerSlam weekend. Needless to say, ticket sales for NXT TakeOver Brooklyn sold out in mere minutes, and we didn't even know the full card yet. Looking back now, the TakeOver Brooklyn card wasn't completely stacked, but it's still my favorite TakeOver event of all time because it felt like a grand spectacle at the time, and it proved that NXT was becoming a global phenomenon. Balor vs. Owens was a ladder match for the ages. Bayley vs. Sasha Banks for the women's title is probably in my top 5 favorite matches of all time. And other names were showcased like Apollo Crews, the Vaudevillains, and especially Blue Pants. And that proved to me that the NXT fan base was behind the product through and through. 2016 is when NXT really took off, and it began to show during WrestleMania 32 weekend in Dallas. An NXT TakeOver event headlined by Samoa Joe versus Finn Balor for the NXT title showed that other guys on the card were just as valued by the fans. American Alpha were cheered when they won the NXT Tag Team titles off the Revival. Everyone was shocked when Asuka defeated Bayley for the NXT Women's Championship. But perhaps the most important match of the night was when Sami Zayn, who was on his way out the door, was already guaranteed a match on the WrestleMania card 2 nights later, came back to NXT one final time to challenge the debuting Shinsuke Nakamura. As 2016 moved into 2017, we saw the rise of talent like the Perfect 10, Ty Dillinger, who was merely a jobber at that first TakeOver Brooklyn. We saw Bobby Roode come from Impact Wrestling to instantly become one of the top heels in the company. With tournaments like the Cruiserweight Classic and the Mae Young Classic, we saw the best and brightest of the independent wrestling scene showcased on a WWE stage, all thanks to the WWE Network. The end of 2017 saw Drew McIntyre, who had recently returned to the company, win the NXT Championship off Bobby Roode at TakeOver Brooklyn, which had now become an annual event. His celebration was immediately cut off by the debuting Adam Cole. Cole sided with Bobby Fish and Kyle O'Reilly, forming the new group, the Undisputed Era. Eventually, the Undisputed Era's reign of terror brought forth the return of the War Games match. 2 rings surrounded by a giant cage to hold whoever was in there. The match had not been seen since 2000, and the honor of its return was given to NXT. 2018 was probably the best calendar year in NXT history, thanks largely in part to the rivalry between Johnny Gargano and Tommaso Ciampa. The two had a series of matches and story beats that NXT fans latched onto all year. It's probably the most homegrown story in NXT history, prior and since. NXT was continuing to light up the scene with solid stories, fantastic matches, and phenomenal breakout talent, and it was consistently the best wrestling in America. That was until 2019. Former WWE talent Cody Rhodes, as well as Ring of Honor / New Japan / Indie talent, the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega, with the funding of billionaire Tony Khan, founded All Elite Wrestling. The promotion had had their first few pay-per-views in 2019, and they were ready to start their weekly television series Dynamite on TNT. WWE tried to counter this by upgrading NXT to 2 hours and putting them up against Dynamite on Wednesdays on the USA Network. Now, NXT and Dynamite were starting at the same time, ending at the same time on 2 different networks. Dubbed the Wednesday Night War, we had finally reached an era of wrestling that we had not seen since the late 90s. Little did WWE know that this war wouldn't turn out as well for them as the last one did. The ratings war between NXT and Dynamite lasted from October 2019 to April 2021. In the key demographic rating, NXT won once. AEW hurt NXT's ratings so badly that in April 2021, they essentially admitted defeat, and WWE moved NXT to Tuesday nights instead of Wednesdays. Now, this was weird because there wasn't a dip in quality on NXT's end. It was still a really good show. This wasn't like WCW and WWF in the 90s. Fans just cared more about AEW in general at the time. Vince McMahon and his team thought that NXT needed a shakeup, And that's probably the worst thing that could have ever happened to NXT. NXT was Triple H's baby. It was a glimmer of hope that the WWE post Vince McMahon was in good hands. His booking style just let talent control their own narrative a lot, and it created organic storytelling. Something that the main roster just was not doing, and that's what made NXT so special. Then Triple H had a health scare and had to leave the company indefinitely. Literally the next week, NXT announced that it would be rebranding into NXT 2.0. It would go back to a more developmental feel, and Vince McMahon and his team would be taking things over in every way. This was bad. On September 14th, 2001, my freaking birthday no less, NXT 2.0 held its inaugural episode. And it featured some of the worst booking decisions in NXT history. There was a fatal four-way match for the NXT title scheduled on this card, pitting Tommaso Ciampa, LA Knight, Kyle O'Reilly, and Pete Dunne against each other. This was a good sign. 4 of NXT's top talents, well known to put on good matches all the time. Maybe there was hope for NXT yet. And then LA Knight was challenged by a debuting Braun Breaker at the start of the night, and for no reason at all, Knight accepted and then lost. On top of that, Kyle O'Reilly was replaced at the last second in the match by a debuting Von Wagner, who nobody at the time knew or cared about. Add on to that, LA Knight was pinned in that fatal four-way match, making him look even worse by comparison. For the longest time, it felt like NXT would never become what it once was. But I'm happy to say that nowadays, NXT is actually a pretty good show. Sure, it's not what it was at its peak, but it's a developmental show highlighting young upstarts by matching them up against established names, and that's what NXT was back in 2012. I think if we give them a few more years, NXT might hit another renaissance point. Well, folks, that was my retrospective on NXT. Overall, I think NXT will go down as my favorite wrestling brand of all time. And, it had its highs and definitely had its lows, but I think the future for NXT is bright, and I think that we might hit that next renaissance point with NXT a few years down the road, which is something that I felt about the original NXT almost 10 years ago. What did you think of NXT in its heyday? What did you think of NXT 2.0's launch? Do you think that NXT can hit another renaissance point like I've been describing? Leave a comment down below. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you will know when my videos post. Until then, I'll see you next week.